Buongiorno a tutti. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning to you all.
That we have this first lecture for the International Festival of Economics here today. As you know, the festival will start tomorrow officially at 3 p.m. We will have an inauguration at the opening of the festival at Teatro Carignano at 3 p.m. with some institutional greetings as usual. These are necessary things to do. And then we will have Tito, who is here and who is the, as you know, who is the director, scientific director of the festival that will interact with Aaron Acemoglu online and with Chris Pissarides, who will be in presence. So we will start very well, but today we are starting really, this is a very fast pre-start of the festival. And we're really honored to have Ed Glaeser with us and Thierry Verdier, who is going to interact with Ed. This, as you know, is the Luca Dagliano lecture, so it's organized in the memory of Luca Dagliano and by the Centro Studi Luca Dagliano. So I have to thank all the team of the Centro Luca Dagliano, Chiara Elli especially, and Simone Orlando also for organizing this, on top of all the team of Collegio Carlo Alberto. So we're very pleased. I mean, there are a lot of institutions who are interacting here, no? So we're very pleased because this lecture is also given within the Marco Fanno conference. The Marco Fanno is an association that it's an alumni association, in fact, of all those who had scholarships from UniCredit or Mediocredit or previously, which is a huge community. And actually, I must say UniCredit Foundation is today the largest provider of scholarships for Italian students and European students that want to go to the US and study abroad. We hope it will still be possible to go to the US and study abroad. Now we're really in a moment in which we start thinking what we're doing here, because I mean we're preparing young people to go to the US to aim to go to Harvard or places like this, and now we learn we can't go there anymore. That's really bad, I think, for the future of the world. But anyway,
it's worse for us than it is for you.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. In fact, we wanted to ask you if you want to come to here. Now there is this thing that's okay, great. We're going to attract all Harvard community will move to Torino. So that's the type of mood we are in. Okay, so this is really a bad moment, but I'm really very pleased. I think that we'll be talking on cities, given that Ed is giving his lecture. And actually, we know that cities are crucial. Urbanization and going to cities and going to places where you can study and work, it's a huge problem for students and young people everywhere in the developed world. We know this is a problem, but also in the developing world. And given that with the Centro Studi Luca Dagliano, we think a lot about development and international economics, it's also nice to think this not as a problem of our part of the world, of our rich world, but it's really a problem that concerns all parts of the world. So without any further ado, thank you very much, Ed, for being here. Thank you very much, Thierry. I leave the floor to Thierry, who will introduce Ed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Giorgio. It's really a great pleasure to have here Ed Glaeser, the speaker of the 23rd lecture on Luca Dagliano on development economics. It's a very good pleasure for many reasons for me. First, because Ed is a world-class leader and prolific scholar in urban economics. If you go through his CV, you'll see that he has written numbers of papers on any dimensions, socio-economic dimension related to urban economics. You can cite them: growth, industrial agglomeration, technologies, entrepreneurship, spatial segregation, ghettos, social interactions, crime, trust, transportation, housing, infrastructures, health, education, skills, property rights, governance, regulatory structures. Name it, and you'll find one paper of him on one of those topics. His contributions are really diverse and widely cited and very influential. I'm not going to cite here his H-index because I will be too much afraid that many of us here will be just strangled by the way we compare to his popularity. I'm also very happy because I met Ed long time ago. In 1992, I was actually a postdoc at Harvard University, and he was just a recent assistant professor going there. And I remember that the two of us had much less gray hair at the time. Also, I remember very well when I read this first paper that was the most cited paper in the JPE, the paper on growth in cities, published in 1992 with Eddie Callell, Jose Schenkman, and Henry Schleifer. At the time, people were fascinated by endogenous growth theory and what was the engine of growth. And one of the engines of growth, according to Paul Romer and others, was the existence of technological spillovers, knowledge spillovers. And so what Aid and his co-authors did was to basically take advantage of the fact that in cities, spillovers are huge because people communicate with each other. And looking at the growth of industries in US cities, he basically found out what was the specifics of those spillovers. In particular, that spillovers were much more across industries than within industries. And that paper, of course, had a huge impact afterwards on the literature on growth and urban economics. Another paper as well that I thought was very intriguing was a paper that he wrote with one of his first students, Alberto Hades, with whom I worked also when I was there, and where the title of the paper is Trade and Circuses, Explain Urban Giants. And in that paper, basically, he tried to explain what were the factors that determine the concentration of population in urban cities, in cities in any country. And finally found that some political factors were particularly important. In particular, that when you were living in a dictatorship country, basically central cities had about something like 50% more population than democratic counterparts. I don't know how it's going to go now in the next future for certain countries, maybe where aid is originating from. There are also other landmark contributions. Landmark contributions in segregation and spatial differentiation across communities between blacks and whites. And he has a number of papers with some of his co-authors, David Cutler and Jacob Vigor, on how actually in the long period, something like from the late 19th century to the 20th century, the structure of segregation between white and black communities was affecting the evolution of cities in the US. Now, there are a couple of other papers that I think are really huge, had a huge impact on the professional literature. One of them is his paper on crime and social interactions, which was written with Bruce Sacerdote and Joseph Stinkman, where actually the motivation for that paper was, you know, economists, when they thought about crime, typically they had in mind the typical Beckerian model of crime behavior. Basically, you commit crime, there's a lottery, penalty, or a gain, and you look at the expected gain versus the expected cost, and that's it. You decide whether or not you're going to be a criminal. Now, when you look at the variance of crime rates across cities in the US, spatially and temporally, it's very hard to explain this high variance of crime rates according to that theory. So what they did, they were the first to introduce the possibility of social interactions and networks, that people were interacting in the community and actually they were copying what other people were doing. And that's way they could generate a social multiplier effects and therefore fit much better the excess variance of crime rates across cities. Now, Ed's curiosity and creativity doesn't stop at urban economics. He has explored also various other avenues, like political economy, social economics and religion, non-for-profit organizations, regulatory economics, even genoeconomics, the discipline that looks at how our genes explain economic behavior, obesity, work and leisure, and so forth. He has even a celebrated controversy with some of my co-authors who got recently a nice prize in economics, where he argues with his co-authors, Rafael Laporta, Florencio Lopez de Silanes, and Andres Schleifer, that what matters for development and growth are not institutions, but human capital. I'm not going to stand on that. I'd leave it to him to defend his position, and I try to keep myself as neutral on that dimension. Now, but on the other hand, I'd like to attract your attention on two pieces. One, which is a very nice piece in political economy and probably has a spatial perspective right now, which is the paper that he wrote on the political economy of hatred, in which he developed a very elegant model of political economy in which you had two sides. The supply side, politicians, and the demand side, voters. The supply side, politicians, they create hate stories, basically from fake news, whatever, Whether this is the truth or not doesn't matter. What matters is that they can penalize, discredit political opponents by using those stories in front of the public. On the other hand, you have voters. They can try to discover or not whether the stories they are told are truth or not. And of course, if they don't have incentive to discover whether there's truth, they prefer to believe the story that is a fake news, and therefore you get this kind of situation, which obviously has quite a big relevance right now in the current world. But now I'm going to give, of course, the floor to Ed to talk about cities, housing, infrastructures. But before this, I cannot resist but to mention a very last piece of Ed's repertoire. This piece is this first paper that he published in the JPE. And this paper illustrates very well his creativity and sense of humor. The name of the paper is The Cinderella Paradox Resolved. What is the Cinderella Paradox? The Cinderella paradox is that when you think about the economics of the family, and you have the standard type of framework where Gary Becker tells us that all parents are benevolent dictators, and therefore, when they want to share resources with their children, they basically, if children have concave utility functions, you want to spread the wealth and the education you provide to the children equally. Now comes the paradox with Cinderella, because Cinderella, this is not the case. In the Cinderella case, you have this little miserable woman, young woman working at the back of the kitchen while the two sisters are preparing for the ball to meet the prince. And the resolution of that paradox is simply that, well, the stepmother is wicked. The stepmother is wicked because simply Cinderella is not her natural child, and she prefers, of course, her own children. Now, I'm going to just cite directly the words of Ed in this paper. Naturally, modern economic theorists find this theory of the wicked stepmother unpalatable. The assumption that parents prefer their own children is ad hoc and arbitrary, founded only on evidence and observation, which is to say not really founded on anything. Careful theorists like him and me prefer their first principles to come from something more reliable than empirical work. A solid source such as Arseny and Zelton, 1988, is far more acceptable. So Ed proposes, of course, a much better explanation of the Cinderella paradox based on modern incentive theory. The marriage market with the prince is a tournament with convex returns. And when we have convex returns, we don't want to spread equally across people, right? The prince will choose the best mate on the basis of her human capital. So then I cite again Ed because this is really hilarious. Everyone knows that the sleeper story is gibberish. And it is much more likely that the prince acted rationally, as in Baker 1974. And the returns to human capital became determined by the prince's choice of mate. Marriage to the prince was obviously a huge price. All of the available men in the kingdom were ex-mice, farmer pumpkins, and so forth. Because lords of the realm were vastly preferable to garden vegetables in the marriage market, and still are, the returns to winning the tournament and to human capital were large and convex. The following model that he's going to present illustrates how old fairy tales can be made much more simple and beautiful with the help of order statistics, which is the type of statistical tool that you use to basically analyze contest situations. Now, I leave it here, and I give the floor to Ed on cities, housing, infrastructures.
Thank you. You know, it is wonderful to see friends of your youth who still, like me, survive, despite we. And it's also wonderful to see friends of older age, and it's great to have beloved students here. Armando, I have a special job for you. If I speak too quickly, you have to put up a T. Okay, it's your job, Armando. I've asked Giacomo many times. He's not reliable. I'm sorry. So it's wonderful to be here. I love the festival, and I wish I could stay. Unfortunately, I had a pre-existing commitment that makes that impossible. But one of the major themes of my life is the importance of face-to-face contact, and so I'm much happier being here live than I would be zooming in tomorrow or the next day. And so I'm very grateful to all of you for accommodating me on this. So I'm going to be talking about cities, housing, and infrastructure. And I want to start by making the observation that cities rest on a three-legged stool. on a triad of three core elements, which, at least for me, form the center of how I think about urban areas. The first of these is the magic of human interactions, right? The fact that we become more creative, more productive when we are enmeshed in a maelstrom of economic activity. And in this picture, that is captured by the old city of Jerusalem, where you can see somebody buying, selling, laughing, learning from people around them. Then the second element of cities is represented by the image below it, which is taken from the time of the Boston Marathon bombing, which is about the demons that come with density. The fact that if two people are close enough to share a smile, they're also close enough to share a virus, right? And there are these forces, whether or not there be traffic congestion or crime or contagious disease, that become strengthened when we live close to one another. Now, the third element of this tripod is the physical city, right? Thucydides, 2,400 years ago, said that a city is not its walls or its ships, but its men. Shakespeare asked, "What is a city but its people?" The way I phrase this is that real cities are made of flesh and blood, not steel and concrete. And the point is that sort of humanity is what makes a city. But let's face it, the steel and concrete also matters. And it shapes the way that we get around. These buildings are the stages on which we live our lives, and they shape how many people get to enjoy the city, how many people get to experience the city. And so I'm going to start off by talking about housing, which has been a major theme of my life over the past 20 years. It's a difficult theme, and in a city like Torino, it's particularly difficult, because there is the tremendous challenge of mass-producing housing, which is absolutely critical for making housing affordable and available to ordinary people, which runs against our sense of obligation to beauty, to the past, to various traditions that make urban spaces. And so, I think the critical element is that we think about this hard and not think that there are free lunches, and at the same time remember that often abundance, supply, is created by people who we think are perhaps even somewhat evil, whereas scarcity is often manufactured by people who we think are saints. And sort of a fundamental theme of this is Adam Smith's theme, that it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, baker, and brewer that we expect our daily bread, or in fact affordable housing, but from their search to their own self-interest. This is housing price growth across OECD countries. For some reason, Italy did not provide data, so I'm sorry that you're out, but I've been told housing is not free here either. And the U.S. number in terms of real housing price over the last decade is 36.3%. There are people like the Netherlands, Finland, and Spain, where price growth has been relatively modest. In other places such as Germany, Sweden, and Norway, the UK, where it's been enormous. And indeed, it is in many ways the fundamental challenge of our urban age. In the U.S., it is associated with, above all, a lack of supply. So this is one measure of the time series of supply. This is housing permits. So this doesn't map one-to-one to the actual number of houses delivered, but it is pretty close. And what you can see is that, in fact, housing production fell off a cliff during the global financial crisis, and it never came back. And in some sense, if America had built housing at the same rate that it built between 1980 and 2000, between 2000 and 2020, okay, let me repeat that statement so it's clear. If the rate of production had been the same between 2000 and 2020 that it was between 1980 and 2000, we would have 15 million more houses, okay? And this shows the reduction in the supply of housing between earlier decades after World War II and today. So somewhat amazingly, between 1950 and 1980, we moved from having 36 million houses to having 87 million houses, which is an astounding change in the physical landscape of my country. Between 1990 and 2020, we went from 102 to 139. The past decade, you can see, is particularly anemic in terms of housing production. This is where the US stands across OECD countries. So this is share of newly constructed housing. You can see the US is slightly higher than the OECD average. So it's US, Denmark, then OECD. There are some places, Turkey is an outstanding performer in terms of building, so is Costa Rica. But many of our, of the core European countries, be they Germany or Spain or Switzerland, are way below the OECD average. Okay, and so there's no repealing the laws of supply and demand. If you have places that are attractive places that people want to come, whether or not they want to come to live, whether they want to come to produce, right, and you make it very difficult to build housing, you're going to risk creating boutique towns that are affordable only to the wealthy. This shows 6 metropolitan areas in the US, and this is from a recent paper of mine with Joe Jerko. Throughout much of the past 50 years, cities like Atlanta, Dallas, Houston, and Phoenix have been the sort of, stars of housing production. Over the last 20 years, those stars have shut down, and they have become much more like the coastal cities that when Joe and I were first working on housing production 20 years ago, we said, LA is shut down, San Francisco is shut down, Boston is shut down, but you still get growth in Phoenix, you still get growth in Atlanta, you still get growth in Miami. That is no longer the case, right? And so as these places have become more elite, places like Buckhead and Scottsdale, which are sort of relatively fancy suburban areas in these places, have become increasingly loath to permit more housing. They've become like Los Angeles, they become like Boston. And you can see all of these places declining. You can see also there was much more volatility variance in the past. So there was a huge amount of variance at one point in time, now that's decreased. And this shows again the 6 markets what's happened to prices. So the one that's remained low, and it bears no resemblance to the other 5, is is Detroit, which is there to capture something of the Rust Belt. There is lots of affordable housing still in Detroit, and they don't build anything because the economy remains in a shambles. But in the 4 growing Sun Belt cities, they've seen their prices go dramatically up, again emphasizing no repealing the laws of supply and demand. Okay, this is a graph that I use to sort of illustrate the fact that supply matters. Along the x-axis is how much new building there is, as measured by permits between 2000 and 2013, again divided by the 2000 housing stock, so it's a ratio. Along the y-axis is the gap between how much it costs to buy a house and how much it costs to build a house. So we're comparing the construction cost, how much it costs to build, with how much it actually costs to buy. So a number like 3 means it costs 3 times more to buy a house than to build. That gulf is explained partially by land prices, but also very much by the difficulty of getting a permit. And so what you can see from here is the places that are really expensive don't build a lot, Los Angeles, Honolulu, and the places that build a lot aren't expensive, okay? Austin, Raleigh, Las Vegas. There is no explaining that variation that comes exclusively from demand-side analysis, right? There is demand for Austin, Texas. There is demand for Raleigh, North Carolina. There's also demand for Honolulu. There's also demand for San Francisco. But the way that demand works its way out is totally different because Austin makes it easy to build and Honolulu does not. And so in one place you have scarcity, you have high prices, you have limited growth. The other you have abundant growth because they make it easy to build massive amounts of housing. Here is a look across the 50 largest metropolitan areas in how housing production has changed over the last 40 years. So in a world of deregulation, we expect 2 patterns to show up in terms of supply across neighborhoods within metropolitan areas. We expect to see places where prices are higher should see more growth, right? You expect to see places where their demand is higher. If supply is relatively unimportant, the high demand places should build. And also, you expect to see places where land is scarce, right, are places where you should see less building, right? So you should expect 2 things when supply is easy. A strong positive correlation between price and construction and a strong negative correlation between density and construction. What you can see from this graph is along the x-axis is the density coefficient as of 1970. Okay, I keep it throughout. And in general, those coefficients were negative, right? So between 1970 and 1980, the places that were denser saw less building. You saw more building in the suburban areas. That stopped. Okay, and that's what it means for all of these coefficients to be functionally 0 and above the 45-degree line. So just look at the last one over there. So whereas we used to build more in the low-density areas where there's abundant land, now in many of these places, the coefficient is completely reversed. We build more in denser areas rather than less dense areas. Why? Because those areas that have become dense are the areas in which it's possible to build for regulatory reasons. Okay? It's not that they're higher price areas, it's that they make it easier to build. And in some sense, regulatory supply issues dictate the shape of America's cities, not where people actually want to live. This is the same coefficient for price. And you'll notice, again, along the x-axis is the price coefficient in the 1970s. It was largely positive in the 1970s. We built in most cities in places where demand was higher. right? Now look, all the coefficients are close to zero, many of them are negative, right? We no longer see a relationship between price and building that's positive, we see one that's negative. Again, just like the switching density coefficient, this is compatible with the view that supply conditions on the ground, in the neighborhood, right, in local zoning boards, is shaping where America builds, right? And we no longer deliver the housing that people want, we deliver the housing that can get through local regulatory controls. In terms of the ways that we sort of document the importance of land use regulation, sort of the simplest way is just to look across metropolitan areas. This is the Wharton Regulatory Urban Land Use Index, and this just shows that more regulated places are more expensive. It's not as simple as that because, of course, regulations don't impact things unless there's demand, but certainly you look at this and you say, sure, regulation seems important. But my favorite test of the importance of regulation, like, uses economics. Uses basic Chicago price theory, okay? Because it's true in all of my life, I'm more enamored of economics, even ridiculous economics like that Cinderella paradox, than I am of anything else. And what this uses is it uses the classic price theory implication, which is in a competitive, decentralized market, marginal cost should equal what? Price. Right? Price should equal marginal cost. Now, building in the US, construction, this is a very competitive industry. There are thousands and thousands of builders in a state like New York City, in a state like New York. And yet, this is from a 2005 paper that I wrote with Joe Jerko and Raven Sachs, and yet in 2005, it cost twice as much to buy than it cost to build an apartment in New York. Now, the beauty of New York apartments is, to add more space, do you need to buy land? No, you don't need more land, so I don't have to worry about the land price. All you need to do is add an extra story. Add an extra floor. And so if the floor size, if the height was deregulated, you would expect to see the marginal cost of adding an extra floor equal to the marginal, to what you get from buying. And yet it was a factor of twofold, right? It was twice as expensive, which was only compatible with the view that in fact we had regulated building in a way that constrained the builders. Now, we did things with decentralized housing, which is of course the bulk of housing as well, but it's harder because of land. The sort of best fact that I had from that is that we compared the value of land if it sits under a new house, in which case it embodies both the value of the land, but also the regulatory right to have that house, with if it extends an existing house. And so what we found was in the places in America that were expensive, an acre of land was worth at least 10 times more if it sat under a house than if it extended a lot, okay? Which is, again, really only compatible with the view that the regulatory burden was significant. Otherwise, you would lop off that piece of land and put another house on top of it, and yet you didn't. Now, when I wrote this work, I was very focused on the gap between the price to buy and the price to build. But what if the price to build also reflects the regulatory burden in the US? And of course, this looks at the prices of high-rises across the world. This is from Turner and Townsend data. And the US, particularly the regulated parts of the US, are an enormous outlier, right? We're very bad at building stuff, whether or not it's subways, where our costs are 4 times the OECD average, or skyscrapers, in which case we're sort of, New York and San Francisco are ridiculous outliers. So to go from, so it's $8,000 a square meter, which is an extraordinary price. Okay, and the new paper that I have on this, which is joint with Giacomo Ponsetto, Leo D'Amico, Joe Jerko, and Bill Kerr, asks this larger question about whether or not regulation itself is responsible for the high physical cost of building. And this shows the long duration of housing productivity in the US, just measured by the simple housing units per employee. And what it shows is that since 1970, productivity has been going backwards. And this is a fact that's also documented by Austin Goolsbee and Chad Syverson, who come before us, talking about the awful decline of construction productivity. And indeed, it is awful, right? We've gotten much worse at building housing over the last 50 years. But the new fact about this graph is it's not inevitable. Right? There are periods in US history, especially the 30 years after World War II, in which American construction productivity got better, in which we got more efficient at producing things. There's nothing magical about housing. You actually can have innovations in housing. It's just that we haven't. It's just that for the last 50 years, we've gone in the wrong direction. Now, one complaint that is sometimes made about this is that, in fact, our houses are different. That in fact our housing is, it's more complicated, it's more beautiful, it's more whatever. Now, you know what else has gotten more complicated over the past 50 years? Our cars, okay? And almost assuredly, the difference between cars in 2025 and cars in 1970 is far more extreme than the difference between houses in 1970 and houses in 2025. And yet, if you look at the automobile industry, cars per employee, which you can see in that graph, has gone way up since 1970, whereas houses per employee have gone down. And so in a normal industry, we get better at doing stuff even as the quality goes up, whereas in housing, it goes in the opposite direction. Now, we have a model. I have promised the interpreter not to sort of inflict algebra on her, so I will move quickly through this. But the core idea of the model is that regulation of entry, regulation of a firm that applies to all of the firm's production facilities, is fundamentally different than regulation of each individual product. And this is fundamentally what housing regulation is about. It's not about going to the ministry and getting a thing which says, oh, you can be a builder. It's that every individual project, some local zoning board has to sign off on. They have fundamentally different effects because the impact of regulation of entry or regulation of the whole firm is to have large, bloated, incumbent entities. Think, General Motors 50 years ago, right? The impact of regulation of each individual product is it shrinks everything. Okay? And the way the model works is because you've got to go through a local zoning board, you propose smaller and smaller projects. There's a span of control cost for each firm, which means that you can't just say, oh, instead of having one 4,000-unit project, I'm going to have 1,000 4-unit projects, right? And you end up shrinking the firm as a whole. As the firm ends up shrinking, right, it no longer invests in research and development, right? Because small idiosyncratic firms don't have, inventors on payroll. And so the few data points that I have left in this, right, I'm just going to document a few facts that are compatible with this model. So first of all, I'm going to show that, in fact, the scale of production has gone down over time. And the sort of key thing that you should have in the back of your mind is that in the immediate post-war world, there were people like William Levitt, who built thousands and thousands of housing units, not just in the US, outside of Paris as well, right, which were actually demanded as much by the French as they were by the Americans. They had more stone. They looked more like country houses properly. But mass production works everywhere. And he, much like Henry Ford before him, figured out how to drive down unit costs by delivering a lot of housing. What's happened to that? So we try to measure the scale of housing projects by using the CoreLogic data, which is, has roughly, 51% of the US population across 167 counties. Our method was we started with a house, right, drawn during a period of 2 years. We then draw a loop around the house, about 100 meters, and we asked, is there another house born in the same 2-year period? If it's born in the same 2-year period, we say it's part of the same project. And then we keep on looping. We keep on looping, we keep on... Excuse me, forgive me. We keep on looping. And with that, we try to put together a sense of what are large projects. Do we assuredly miss things? Yes. Do we have various forms of errors? But for the large projects, we can go in and actually ask, was this actually a project? And so, for example, this is Lakewood, which was the largest development in LA County in 1950-51. And this shows the path in LA, which in the immediate early 1950s, there are projects like Lakewood that involved 3,000 units. And while they weren't produced in a factory, they had a factory-like structure. The carpenters would go up and down the street and so forth. And you saw these projects with 3,000 units. Since 1970, there has been no project that's larger than 1,000 units in our data. We found nothing that looks anywhere like it. And so you just see a shutting down of sort of large-scale production. And in some sense, that sort of small scale is, to us, the villain in all this. That in fact, if you expect to see production innovation, you need large scale. This is another fact that goes along with it, which is the average size of residential construction firms. So if you look at most American industries, the average number of employees per establishment is large. So take tradables, non-tradables, manufacturing, services, right? More than 50% of employees are in establishments with 500 or more employees. So they're in big establishments. What about residential construction, right? Complete outlier. More than 50% of the workers are in establishments with fewer than 10 employees. More than 35% of the workers are in establishments with fewer than 5 employees. You know what 5-employee establishments don't have? They don't have research and development departments, right? They do manage to avoid local labor regulations. They do manage to avoid a bunch of different rules which gets them out of things, but they certainly aren't involved in technological innovation. And in some sense, this is what we've created, an industry that looks unlike any other because the exigencies of the way that we regulate building means that everything is tiny. And if everything is tiny, we don't solve problems. Last fact related to this, patenting. These series are normed so that they have the same value in 1930. And we're just looking at patenting levels in construction, manufacturing, elsewhere. For most of the 100 years before 1950, these three series move remarkably in lockstep. Okay? Then they start diverging a little bit after 1950, massively after 1980. Okay? And whereas American manufacturing has firms like SpaceX or NVIDIA that sort of do amazing things, American construction does nothing like that. Right? We just build housing with sticks the way that we did in the 1960s, and we go on in our unproductive way. Okay? And this is in some sense what, the well-meaning regulators who shut down mass production, who said we're never going to have any more Bill Levitts, we're never going to have anything that transforms the whole neighborhood, that's what they created. They did so largely for highly laudable reasons. They were protecting the local environment, they were protecting the local neighborhoods, they were protecting the history. But the downside of that is you don't get the sort of scale and transformation that is possible. And I think in a place like Torino, where it's really hard, because in fact my father was an architectural historian, I believe that our buildings are among our greatest legacies. But the one thing I would argue for, without any hesitation, is the value of always having cost-benefit analysis in whatever regulation you're going to put forward, right? Don't act as if there's a free lunch. Don't act as if you can just preserve a local neighborhood, stop change, and that no one will be worse off. You are imposing costs, and make sure that the benefits outweigh the costs in terms of whatever you're doing. Okay, I'm going to move to a couple of other things. Now, we've talked about all that I'm going to say about housing. I'm going to move on to opportunity and infrastructure. First point that I want to make. So much of the last 35 years of my life has been extolling the wonderful things that cities have done for urban productivity. It turns out cities appear to be much better for adults than they are for kids. And so this is particular to the US, where we have this data from Raj Chetty, where you look at a generation born around 1980, you look at where they are as adults, and this shows the positive relationship between per capita GDP and density, and this shows the negative relationship between upward mobility and density. And so what's going on here? Well, how is this possibly happening? I think one hypothesis is that cities are fundamentally about mixing. Cities are about connecting people together. And it is at least possible that cities are much better for allowing the mixing of adults than they are for kids, right? Even if you wake up in a poor part of the city, you typically will go to work in a firm where you will mix with people other than yourself, right? By contrast, a child who wakes up in a poor area, right, goes to school in a segregated school, plays in a segregated block, experiences a much more isolated life. We've done our best using cell phone data and their variety of shortcomings, and we've established a little bit of a difference between kids and adults. Part of the problem is we don't see any adults, any kids younger than 16, and we only identify them from looking at people who go to schools. But there is at least some evidence to suggest the idea that kids are experiencing a different world. This looks at kids and adults as a changed density. Adults actually see roughly the same amount of mobility. The mobility of kids plummets. And so kids in highly dense neighborhoods just are living very limited lives. They're also spending more time at home, less time at school, whereas actually adults in denser areas spend more time at school. This is the more striking fact on this, which is through Cody Cook's amazing work, he links the cell phone with the value of the home in which they live. And so this is a proxy for permanent income, the value of the home. And so what this shows is how different the lives of kids who live in fancy homes are from kids who live in poor homes. And what you can see in this, and look particularly at the visits to amenities, is along all of these dimensions, the richer kids are moving around more. They're visiting places more. Now, in some places like going to retail shops or restaurants, these things are expensive, and so you're not surprised by that. But going to parks, rich kids go to parks much more you can see it, that's the triangle. They go about 40% more to parks than poor kids do. Right? Sort of an amazing thing, despite the fact that parks are free. They're experiencing the city in a different way, in a much more limited way. So this just shows it at higher level. And this shows if I control for metropolitan area on the left-hand side, if I control for the tract of where you live, so I'm comparing houses that are literally next to each other and asking whether or not that explains why the poor kids go to parks instead of less, it explains about half. Okay? About half of it completely persists even within basically the block in which they live. Okay, now mobility partially has to do with walking, but partially it has to do with the state of roads. And so one of my current obsessions is the state of America's roads, in part because I spend far too much time driving on America's roads, and it's not always too pleasant. Now, this shows what we know about the state of highways before we began our work. And along on the left-hand side is the American Society of Civil Engineers gives American highways grades, okay? And the grades are terrible. It used to be a B minus, and now it's a D. I don't know what the European equivalent of this, but it's, you're like on the edge of failing. You used to go from sort of being respectable to sort of being ready to be kicked out of school. But at the same time, the Department of Transportation sends out trucks that measure how bumpy the roads are. At 3 o'clock in the morning, it sends out the same trucks, and those trucks experience smoother and smoother rides over the same time period. And so the American Society of Civil Engineers, and it's nice to see when our economic models are vindicated, it's behaving exactly the way you would expect an interest group to follow, which is they're saying, you need to spend another $3 trillion on us, please. And in that spirit, I would like to announce both to the EU and to the US, we are facing a shocking deficit in education in economics, and we need to have a $3 trillion agenda for spending on economists providing education for people. And we are giving the grade of a close to failing grade to all of our countries for failing to spend enough on economists to provide education. But the problem with this number is that this is a number that's only true on highways. And certainly when I drive to work, when I drive my son to school, the highways are fine. It's all the local roads that are hell. And we haven't had measures of local road roughness, typically, because it's not paid for by the national government until now. Now, luckily, due to the kindness of a former student of mine who's the chief economist at Uber, we have essentially a month's worth of data from Uber, which contains, like for all of their drivers, how bumpy all the roads are. 5 times a second, Uber phones ping back their vertical acceleration to Uber. And so for every road in America, this is giving you how bumpy the road is. Now, there's a bunch of difficult statistical things that first they do a bunch of stuff, which is sort of factoring out things related to the cell phone, and then we do a bunch of stuff. And this is like the stuff that we do. Okay, the stuff we do essentially controls for the driver's car, it controls for the speed of the driver, it estimates a slope that's particular to the road, so different roads are, and then we then use this to measure essentially how rough 8.2 million road segments are, covering 516,000 kilometers of road in the US. So we have measures of sort of how bad all of America's roads are. And so this is a map of Chicago, and we're predicting roughness at different speeds. So we tell you how rough it's going to be at 20 miles per hour on a local road, at 32 miles per hour on an arterial road, and 48 miles per hour on a highway. And this is what Chicago looks like. You can see the sort of core part of the city is incredibly rough. The outlying suburbs are nicer, right? And you can see the discrete jump that occurs at the city border. And those discrete jumps are going to be important in what's about to follow. We then do a bunch of things to document this. So on highways and arterial roads, we're able to compare our measures with the measures that come out of the Department of Transportation data. And that looks fairly good. Okay, so this is what these things look like. One of the reasons why it's less than perfect is that for Chicago, we do a lot of hand matching. For these other things, we use the open street maps road, and there's going to be imperfect matching on things. But it's still an over 50% R squared. There's less R squared with the New York City pavement condition index. That's a visual index that looks at how rough the road appears and then measures roughness based on that. We felt bad about that. But then we noticed, and this is what you're seeing in this graph, then we noticed that our measure strongly predicts how slow cars are going. Their measure doesn't predict it at all. Okay? And so that leads us to believe that the reason why our measure isn't that strongly correlated with theirs is that our measure is actually good and their measure is actually pretty crappy. And there's a warning in that embedded in the fact that many cities use these pavement condition indices, and I think actually just measuring roughness by actually measuring how bumpy it is just a lot better than looking at an image and trying to say how rough it is. This is a picture of America, and so the coasts are kind of bad and the interior is kind of smooth. So if we were riding from Detroit, which is very smooth roads, or Nashville or something, we would not have the same problems that we did in New York. It's not particularly a red state, blue state. Houston, Texas has terrible roads. The claim is that it's got clay in the soil. There's not as clear of a temperature thing as I would have thought going into it. I sort of thought that the freeze-thaw cycle would be huge, but there are lots of cold parts in the center of the US that seem to be fine. The presence of a lot of trucks, the presence of ports. Richer metropolitan areas actually have worse roads, not better roads. Okay, to estimate the pain that this imposes on the riders, we again use economics. And we're going to use the sort of intuition of this is you have an ability to pay to have a smoother drive. How do you pay to get a smoother drive? You slow down, okay? And in essence, that gives you a willingness to pay for a smoother road by looking at how much people slow down when the road gets rougher. So to estimate this model, we need to look at how speeds change with particularly salient changes in bumpiness. What are our most salient changes in bumpiness? Town borders. And so we're able to look at the discontinuity around borders at how much people slow down, and we're going to estimate how much people are willing to pay with their time in order to experience a softer drive. And so that's what this estimates. So I have the picture here. Yeah, so this shows Chicago. So like it's stark, okay? This is not some subtle thing. Like the left-hand side shows how much it gets smoother as you leave Chicago. The right-hand side shows how much you speed up, okay? And so we do this in thousands and thousands of borders throughout America, and we estimate an elasticity of speed with respect to roughness. Then we have to put this in a model, and sort of if you want the core idea of the model, it's like you're trying to minimize time cost, bumpiness cost, and some other cost of speed, which we assume is proportional to the speed limit, to the law. We can then estimate this, but the core idea is that the first order condition, which is this thing, tells you that the elasticity of speed with respect to bumpiness is kind of the same as just the straight direct effect of impacting bumpiness on welfare using the envelope theorem. And so we use that to back this out. And so this elasticity then ends up playing a crucial role. We sort of piece it together to integrate under the firm. If that made no sense to you, don't worry about it. Just we have a magic model that enables us to go from the speed relationship to a social cost. The one thing you should know about this model is that we assume the value of time is $15 an hour. Okay, which is typically in transportation models half of the wage. If you think it should be much more or much less, just multiply it by whatever you think your wage is times 15. This is the cost that we get from bumpiness. So the median roughness cost has a cost of 31 cents a mile. One standard deviation higher road roughness is 23 cents a mile. If we use the limits of this thing is it can double if I use the road repaving estimates. We have other, I highlighted on this the border discontinuity. We also have estimates that come from railroad crossings, and we have estimates that come from road repaving, which are somewhat different, but they yield numbers which are generally larger. Okay, so what do you learn from this? Well, you learn that richer people have smoother roads, richer neighborhoods have smoother roads, and whiter neighborhoods have smoother roads. The bulk of the difference between white and non-white neighborhoods is across towns, not within towns. And you see this by comparing regression 4, column 4 with column 6. Okay, column 4 shows a coefficient of like positive 0.15. That drops to positive 0.019. And so it's not so much that within a city, like the rich people get nicer neighborhoods, get nicer roads than the poor people. It's that, in fact, poor people live in cities that have worse roads. They live in towns that have worse roads. And so they live in Chicago, they live in the central city, whereas it's Evanston, which has actually the nicer roads. And so this is just a picture of Chicago, New York City. And one fact that I will show you in a second that really comes out of our data is that in big cities, actually, it flattens out. So it's in suburbs, it's in sort of more elite areas where the poor people, African Americans, tend to live in crappier places. In a city like New York, it's actually often the opposite. So this is New York, and I just want you to look at the tip of Manhattan. That's Tribeca, right? Like Tribeca is packed full of guys who are worth like $500 million, okay? And the roads are terrible, okay? This is what sort of big cities are like. By contrast, the outer boroughs like Staten Island, which is full of like cops, police officers, has much nicer roads. This shows this interaction, like in smaller and richer towns, you have steeper gradients. In big towns, you have flatter gradients. Road expenditure does not explain this. So it's not as if you just control for how much people spend and you explain away this difference. In fact, if anything, of course, town level expenditures correlate positively with roughness, not negatively, because of the endogeneity of the town expenditures. Now, here's the central fact, okay? And this sort of encapsulates like my issue with sort of expanding the reach of government in lots of ways, okay? This shows the probability of being repaved by the government within 8 months as a function of how rough it was. So what this shows you is in New York, there's a weak positive relationship between repaving and initial roughness. In none of the other 3 towns is there any relationship between how rough the road and does it get repaved. We now have expanded this number to 11 cities. In 8 out of the 11, it is orthogonal between how initial roughness and repaving. And so whatever you think should be done, it is hard to come up with a model that says, I'm going to repave the smooth roads as often as I repave the rough roads. And yet this is exactly what we do. And sort of before you think that the United States should be embracing on some kind of high-tech industrial policy to hyperchange innovation, can you really trust a country that can't figure out which roads to pave to figure out which industrial policy will actually maximize long-term welfare? I think that's what I take away from this. And in some sense, sort of the big takeaway is, why does this happen? It's not unusual for big cities. They have a mandate. The mandate is typically done with something like a pavement condition index, and the mandate is vastly overambitious. So this came from a survey of hundreds of cities and towns. Typically, the respondents said that less than 50% of the roads that were supposed to be repaved are repaved. And given that you have a mandate, you don't bother to target. And so you're supposed to repave all of these roads. You only repave 40% of them, and you have no mechanism for choosing which 40% are being repaved. On top of that, there are political things, like one former mayor told me, well, if I'm going to repave this road, I have to repave all of the 3 roads that are next to it, because otherwise the neighbors will complain. And so with that, you sort of get nothing out of this. Okay, last thing I want to give you. So the prevalence of really cool and interesting data has sort of been in the process of transforming urban areas. I showed you a little bit with cell phones earlier. Now I want to move to something that's even a little bit cooler and weirder. And this is joined with Carlo Ratti, Ariana Salazar-Miranda, and others, which is movies. Okay? Now, by taking films of how people use urban space, you can figure out strange and wonderful things about how people use urban areas. Now, in some sense, the founding father of this was a guy called Holly White, who in the 1970s and 1980s took a huge amount of movies of different urban spaces. Holly White earlier had been a hugely successful writer. He penned a book called The Organization Man. He was an editor at Fortune magazine, and he discovered a young New York City housewife who had unusually crisp insight into urban space. Her name was Jane Jacobs. And in fact, it was Holly White's support for Jane Jacobs that led to her publication of The Death and Life of Great American Cities. But we took his movies. We had 4 areas, and we also had movies from roughly 15 years ago. And so we're going to use this to compare how this space is used. So this is like what the pictures look like. Chestnut Street is Philadelphia. Bryant Park is New York City, back of the public library where the lions are. The stairs of the Metropolitan, and Downtown Crossing in Boston. And so we're able to look at things like how often people hang around there. So this is the share of people who are spending more than, I forget how many seconds this is in the movie. That has radically declined over time. Especially above all, Downtown Crossing, which was sort of a place where people hung out in 1980. It's now a place where people are going from point A to point B and getting out of Dodge. The Metropolitan has, if anything, sort of, also had a decline, but it stays higher. Bryant Park and Chestnut Street have had the least changes. And, a simple model of this is just its opportunity cost of time. Higher wages mean that people use this less, but it's interesting to see people using urban spaces differently. This shows speeds, and you can see, there's a fairly substantial increase in speeds between 1980 and 2010. People are walking faster in these urban spaces. They're particularly walking faster in Downtown Crossing, but in all of these areas they're walking faster. This shows how many people are joining up with other people. Overall in the areas, the number of dyads, meaning that we identify 2 people as being together, has stayed relatively constant, but there is big differences over areas. In particular, Bryant Park has more dyads in 2010 than it did then. Downtown Crossing has less. And the way to understand this is Bryant Park was like when I was a kid growing up in New York, this was like a dangerous place. Like the people who went there were by and large looking for something largely illegal, and they were getting in and getting out as quickly as possible, right? Now it's a beautiful place where you can go and hang out and it's lovely, right? By contrast, Downtown Crossing was a place that you'd hang out, not because it was nice, but because, I don't know, what else were you going to do? Now people are like walking through the area, and it's sort of changed. This shows the churn rates. So churn rates means how many people have left the movie after how many seconds. The 1980 churn rates are all below the 2010. This shows the pedestrians forming group encounters. We're sort of forming a lot fewer groups. There's much less meeting up with people in the movies than there used to be beforehand. And that's what the other graph shows as well. So I'm going to end there, but I'm going to end with a sort of larger statement, which is I'm an urban economist. I study cities. I study cities in the US, I study cities in the EU, I study cities in the developing world. And cities are just unbelievably fascinating things. I must say I'm driven above all by pure curiosity, right, by the fact that I find the way that human beings interact with each other and find possibilities in urban spaces to be endlessly fascinating. But this stuff also has enormous policy impact, right? Whether or not you're worried about something which pushes the boundaries of mundaneness, like road repaving, or let me rise instead to like figuring out how to protect Jakarta against climate change, which feels like almost existential. These are all fundamentally urban problems. And in fact, the skills are not that different. Right? A city that can't repave its roads properly is also unlikely to be able to deal with floods either. And so thinking about the sort of public sector productivity as part of that is sort of hugely important. And so, for anyone who's sort of young here, let me just end with this, which is it has been a tremendous joy to spend the last 37 years of my life thinking about the urban world and trying to make sense of it and learning from cities and learning from other people around me. And I think, and I hope that for some of you as well, this may be a great way to spend your life as well. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Ed, for this brilliant lecture and specific aspects of cities. Before maybe opening the floor and asking questions, I had just a couple of comments or questions. One of them is that you mentioned that much of the housing crisis relates to lack of productivity, innovation of the housing sector on the supply side. And that seems to be very much related to the regulatory context. So then one aspect that I know that you worked on that somehow, but you didn't speak too much about it, is what are the political economy dimensions that tend to explain why the type of regulation that we have given the cost that you tend to mention and the problems that are related to American cities. The other thing is a bit more general, given that the lecture is on the development, and I know that you worked as well on cities in developing countries. What are the challenges right now for cities in developing countries? Given that something like, you mentioned to young people that they need to learn more and research more on urban economics, about something like 50% or 55% of the world population is living in cities. It's projected to be going to something like 70% in 20 years from now or 30 years from now. And that somehow about something 40% of the people that are living in developing cities, they don't have access to any right infrastructures, sanitations, access to drinking water, and things like that. So what are according to you the major challenges for those cities, and in the short term and the medium term and eventually in the future? Okay.
Two amazing questions. So first of all, political economy of housing. So the problem is, for most homeowners in this world, expensive housing isn't a problem. It's a positive on their balance sheet. Okay, and so the last thing most homeowners want is to encourage a policy that is going to reduce the value of their most important asset, and not only that, create a bunch of headaches while they're doing it, right? Because there's going to be traffic and there's going to be all sorts of pain. And so the political economy of creating change in the housing industry is incredibly hard. Typically, larger districts look better. So the work of Clémence Tricot, who compares compares jurisdictions in France that are consolidated, that are brought together with largest jurisdictions, finds that previous places that sort of prevented all housing now create more housing in those areas. And it's easy to see why, because larger jurisdictions have leaders who internalize the benefits to firms of allowing more building, the benefits to bankers, the benefits to builders. All of those get internalized in a way that is not true if you're just looking at a leafy suburb. But it's a political nightmare, and in some sense, when I first started working on this stuff 25 years ago, there were like 2 libertarian economists who didn't think I was wasting my time. Everyone else was like, why the heck are you working on something as stupid as like housing regulation in America's suburbs? Now, I hear Barack Obama talking about this on the floor of the Democratic National Convention, and it's like, on one level, it's wonderful, right? On the other level, like, the reason why he's talking about it is because the problem hasn't gotten any better, okay? In fact, it's gotten worse, and part of that reflects the fact that this is so difficult politically to move through. But again, I think it's sort of a long slog, and there's some chance that we'll get legislation out of Congress in the next year, but it's going to be very weak. It's going to be symbolic. Okay, we're going to get symbolic pro-housing legislation. We're not going to get something that actually changes things. If you actually ask me what I think a sensible policy would be, it would be tying federal spending, tying U.S. government national spending to local production of housing. That's the sort of national policy that would make sense. There also are things at the state level, which sort of states can restrict the ability of localities to ban housing. So Massachusetts has rules on this, California has rules on this, and we could see more of that genre. Your second question was, what's interesting and important in developing world cities? Well, kind of everything. Okay, I would say if you're choosing above all, I would be focused on the downsides of density. So figure that the firms will figure it out on their own, but sort of they're not going to solve the problems that come with high density living. So to me, above all, the first job of city government is what? Okay, the Romans knew it more than anyone else. It's clean water. Okay, the first task is to make sure that there's something like the modern equivalent of aqueducts that's working. This may relate to sort of maintenance in some areas. It may relate to pricing. I work with Nava Ashraf on water in Zambia. That's a thing. But like that's above all. But sewers, electricity, all of this stuff is sort of critical to think through. Property rights are deeply enmeshed in this. Crime, if you're working in Latin American cities, like you surely want crime to be at the top of your list in terms of thinking about this stuff. So like all of these sort of downsides of density become central. I will make a plug for another research agenda which is particular to sort of rule of law in developing world cities, which is, there's a complementarity between urban density and law. Right? Because when you're close to another, there are externalities which occur all over the place. This is sort of particularly important when you have more vulnerable people in cities. Because in fact, the ability to sort of form partnerships, to work together is harder if you're more likely to, if you're more vulnerable. Now, Nava Ashraf has sort of made the case, and we sort of have models of this and evidence of this, that this is particularly important for women taking advantage of African cities. She works in Zambia, and she does a fair amount of ethnographic work with female entrepreneurs in Lusaka. And there's just a lot of evidence that they're much less able to engage in collaborative behavior than men are, largely because the men act like jerks, unsurprisingly, right? In different ways that I will not enumerate here. And we have a paper that seems to suggest that you can actually get more sharing behavior if you create things like, functional course of justice. In this case, it's actually market chiefs who can punish the guys who behave badly, and you get more collaborative behavior in different ways. I will say the fact from that paper that I like best is the fact that typically men learn their skills from other entrepreneurs, from relatives, from people around them. Women learn their skills from paid courses. And in some sense, that shows you that sort of the fact that they can't trust men to behave decently means that this whole great advantage of cities that, as Alfred Marshall famously said, that in dense clusters, the mysteries of the trade become no mystery, but are as it were in the air, that gets turned off for women because they are unable to trust the people around them.
Thank you. Tito, you had a question.
Well, more than a question, first of all, I wouldn't take time off for questions. I simply take the floor just to tell you that we have to be grateful to Ed because he has slowed down the talk, the speed of the talk, but not much the speed at which he presented all of his facts. But this is part of the enthusiasm that he has for his agenda. So I want to reassure that the slides and everything will be on the website. We'll have time to digest what was presented today, so even if you couldn't follow everything, so that's important. Now, a question I have. Regulations are clearly different from town to town, municipality to municipality for very good reason, depending on the externality may be stronger in some areas, environmental concern and so on. There ought to be some measure of the strictness of these regulations that could be possibly divided by doing text analysis or So I think that would be a real test of your story, because the difference between cost to build and cost to buy, as well as also the size of the firms in the construction sector, ought to be somewhat correlated to the strictness of this regulation. So I wonder whether that would be a convincing, I think, story.
So this is a measure, this is the Wharton residential land use thing. So this is a measure of regulatory roughness that's sort of averaged. These things typically come by sending out surveys and asking how difficult it is to build, to get permits. And this correlates strongly with home value. It also correlates negatively with firm size and negatively with productivity across metropolitan areas. We also have, for particular cities within Boston, we engaged in sort of a large scale, like micro-matching all the things. There you don't expect productivity to be that different, but you do see much less housing production in the places that are more restrictive. There's new work by Arpit Gupta, Alex Bartik, and I think a third co-author that sort of uses, as you suggested, the sort of machine learning algorithms to look at verbiage. It's showing by and large similar things, that you have higher prices and less production in these areas. The one challenge in terms of the sort of productivity premium to sort of be focused on is that, like, part of the way that we think about our model is that because you have these small, crappy firms, right, in some sense, the overall productivity frontier, even in Texas, is more restricted than it should be. And so there's sort of a national loss from doing this. I mean, we can then debate whether or not, the cross-metro area variation in this regulatory toughness is endogenous and related to other stuff. But certainly, as you suggested, like the cross-place correlation between regulatory toughness and firm size is strongly negative, and firm productivity is strongly negative as well.
So, Ed, I just wonder if you could unpack the regulation thing a little bit more for me. In particular, if you could talk a little bit about the heterogeneity of zoning laws in the US as a major explanation of differences in housing costs and housing prices. So as it happens, I own property in a Chicago suburb, which is very heavily zoned, and I own property in rural Michigan where there is no zoning. You can put down anything you want, whatever you want. And I'm kind of curious if you think differences in zoning law don't play a bigger role in this than you have given it so far. The other thing, and just follow up on what Tita was saying, I'm a little bit curious about the demand for housing regulation and to what extent regulation is supposed to protect the buyer from unscrupulous or incompetent home builders and contractors, in the sense that mistakes by these contractors can actually lead to major health or other consequences for the buyer, and that the information cost of finding out whether this guy has used asbestos in setting up the house, whether the sewage system is not going to back up, whether there are going to have electrical fires. You can sort of see there's a huge amount of information that the vast bulk of the population doesn't have, and that the nanny state would feel that you need to protect people from these sort of unscrupulous builders.
Thank you, Joel. Those are both helpful comments. So first of all, I want to separate out building codes from land use regulations. So building codes are largely what stops there from being asbestos, or, to my knowledge, the first building regulation in the United States was in 1631 in Boston. They banned thatched roofs. Thatched roofs are bad because they burn like crazy. I got no problem with that regulation. Okay, it's a clear rule that has a clear externality going forward. Now, it is also true that, so Joel took us on the what if my neighbor builds a house that's likely to burn, right? Which is right, we should be worried about this. Probably we particularly want to worry in light of the fires that lit up Los Angeles for much of the last year. Much of those have to do with, again, roofs, the same sort of, you don't want thatched roofs, you might also want metal roofs in these particular cases, and sort of thinking about the sort of clear externality there. Now, it's also true that if someone put up an apartment building next to Joel's house, like, he would probably lose from that as well. He's going to lose his view in some other way. So there's an externality there as well. The problem is not that we have regulations that try to take into account like those kinds of externalities. The problem is that there has never, to my knowledge, ever been any cost-benefit analysis of whether or not the benefits of that regulation offsets the costs. And there clearly are costs from it. Certainly when I have gone about and tried to estimate how much lower are high-density parts of Boston in terms of price than low-density places, I see a very tiny slope. which suggests that in fact these regulations are, there's this sort of mathematical calculation which is roughly the regulatory tax, the gulf between how much it costs to buy and how much it costs to build, should actually be equal to the elasticity of price with respect to density across towns. And it's like 5 times in Boston, okay? It's a major, which, you know, it suggests that in fact we've gotten it way, way too restrictive over space. So I'm not trying to argue that there aren't those externalities, and certainly when there are things that are intimately related to health and safety, I'm probably willing to, which are mostly about building codes, not about the land use regulations. There, you know, I'm certainly more than open, but I think by and large we've just enacted these laws without thinking very much about it, largely because existing incumbents like it. One way to think about this is, you know, Mancur Olson wrote The Rise and Decline of Nations 40 years ago, and he argued that in mature societies, insiders capture regulatory frameworks and figure out how to say no to outsiders. And, you know, as a result, this growth slows down, they become stagnant, they become unaffordable to ordinary people. Now, I read this in the early 1990s, and it sounded like maybe it was New York, maybe it was these examples that Olson had, England in the 1970s, pre-Meiji Restoration Japan. It didn't sound like the American Sun Belt then. It sounded like, you know, it seemed to me that like Texas was not captured by outsiders. Today, I think that Olson was just a visionary, right? And I think that in fact America has increasingly been captured by insiders who are making it difficult for outsiders to find a way. And I'll make another sort of like meta observation, which is part of the beauty of being like an academic economist who gets to choose which policy issues you decide to focus on. Is I like kind of 2 things. I wanted to choose, I'm a Chicago PhD, I kind of like freedom, right? I kind of like giving people more options, but I also kind of like doing stuff for poor people, right? So I kind of favor progressive stuff. And what I like about the cause of land use regulation is it's both pro-freedom and pro-poor people, right? It's pro-outsiders, it's creating a nation that's sort of more open to outsiders. And that's sort of a reason why I chose this 25 years ago as sort of a policy topic that I wanted to focus on. Differences with Michigan, I think the answer is if all of a sudden there was enough demand for rural Michigan that you had a whole bunch of like high-end people building their country houses there, you'd start seeing a lot more regulation there as well, no matter what happened.
No, I had a microphone because I thought I wanted to ask exactly the same question, whether can we distinguish bad from good regulation, but I think you answered very thoroughly, so maybe someone else wants to have a question. Yes.
I have a question which may be silly, but I'm just wondering whether after the recent announcement of President Trump, the price of property in Harvard will drop.
We'll see. The fighting's in rounds, and we're not over yet.
Other question?
Yeah, hold on.
One more question. I'm an architect, so excuse me for getting wrong what you said. But there is in the debate about housing, especially in Europe, there is a tendency to answer that the problem is not producing new houses, but bringing back to the market houses that are already there and are empty. Could you maybe expand on this research? I'm personally skeptical on that, but I'm an architect, so I'm interested in Millie.
I mean, unless there's some form of regulatory process, it seems like the market would work perfectly well at bringing back underutilized housing. And so I have trouble understanding why, if there's so much, if prices are as high as they are, and if it would be easy to just bring the underutilized housing, why the market doesn't take care of it on its own. I want to make a particular, though, like I want to actually respond to the architect on historic preservation, which I think is actually important. And part of my being offended by American and New York's historic preservation laws is the fact that I am the son of an architectural historian. And I am offended that, in fact, we have deemed huge amounts of the Upper East Side of New York City, which has utterly undistinguished glazed brick post-war housing, to be worthy of protection in the same way that Bruges is, right? And I find that sort of absolutely insane. And in fact, some of my favorite moments in architecture are ones when you see a dialogue between a 17th century architect and a 21st century architect. And I think these are just amazing things. And in some sense, it's not just that we are like shutting down new housing supply, we're shutting down the creativity of an amazing industry that's able to figure out how to work new buildings into old spaces and to create absolutely creative marvels that, you know, are wonderful. And yet you got to build new stuff. It's not just about moving the vacancies off. It just won't add up and so forth. So great.
Thank you very much, Ed, for this brilliant lecture. Still another question. You want to say something, Tito?
No.
Okay, thank you very much, Ed, for this brilliant lecture. Very interesting topic and essential for the future of our societies. I think we can close the session right now. And again, thank you very much.
And we'll do this again in 30 years? We'll do another thing?
One thing you have, avete una card, questa carta verde sulle sedie, se la inquadrate avrete ci sono delle domande a cui se rispondete credo siamo molto contenti perché è un sondaggio per capire